And I'm here with Anthony Nelson from 2S Water Incorporated, coming us down from Edmonton to WEFTEC, Water Environment Federation's Technical Exposition and Conference. Anthony, tell us a little bit about 2S.
So we have a device for detecting metal concentrations in water. So we go into a water treatment plant either at the beginning to tell them how much metal is in the water that they've got to take out, or at the end to tell them that they've actually succeeded in taking the metal out of the water. We do it in real time, which means that they can actually feed the data back into the control systems and use that data to determine how much chemical they use, which is a typically 25 to 30% savings in chemical over a period of time.
So what are the kinds of metals that are going to get into our drinking water sources, and why are they getting there?
The most common is calcium, magnesium, iron, occasionally lead, arsenic, cadmium, chromium, and some of them, calcium you need. So the fact that it's in the water is actually almost good for you. Chromium, not so much. You don't really want to have that in the water because it really has negative health impacts.
So where does it come from before it gets there?
Basically, it's when it rains up in the mountains, the water falls onto the rock, and certain variants of each of these elements is water soluble, and it gets dissolved in the water and just runs downstream. So
basically we're talking about naturally occurring metals, naturally occurring contaminants that get into the source waters that, under certain circumstances, if it's raining or if some activity is going on, some land development, mining activity.
One of the problems that the water treatment plant has is, on an average day, there may not be very much of it. But if it rains up in a particular valley, all of a sudden you've got a spike. It comes through, and you have a high concentration of, say, chromium that comes through and may last for 2 or 3 days, and then it's gone. And if you don't know it, you don't treat for it, and you have a problem where you're producing contaminated water.
So the utility's job is to treat for whatever comes into their plant.
That's right.
Without knowing for sure what's coming into their plant until at the last minute.
And the regulations are really weak. The water treatment plant, by law, must test the water once a quarter. Which means that if it rains up in the hills on Wednesday, and you take the sample on Tuesday, you don't see it. So it's a challenge for the water treatment companies to be able to handle this. We give them the ability to see what's happening as it's happening. So every minute or every 5 minutes, depending on the way their control systems are set up, it will take a reading, it would feed it back into the control systems, and the control system would say, chromium. To get rid of chromium, I've got to add more of this. Chromium level is up, so we increase the amount of chemical we add. And then when the chromium level goes down, it says, I don't have as much chromium, so I turn it down a little bit. I don't need to put as much chemical in. Over a typical annual cycle, it's a 25 to 30% savings in chemicals.
Now, in terms of our water and wastewater utilities, those are, so the water treatment utilities, that's after human resources, after their staff, their number 2 expense and the cost of our water bills comes from what?
Mostly it's probably energy, and it may be chemicals, but it's
so
sort
energy,
of between the two.
Between the three, you've got people, energy, and chemicals. That's what you need.
And those are typically what it is. You reduce the chemicals, you also reduce the energy. And then they have another cost of landfill once they've pulled the chemicals out. And if you reduce the amount of chemicals, you also reduce the cost of landfill. So there's some substantial. Reducing the cost of energy means you're producing less CO2. Less CO2 in the environment means less global warming.
So you put all that together at scale, and you get utilities all over the country that are doing better in terms of what kind of treatment. It's not just, well, let's hit everything with everything we got. You know, have a bunch of chlorinated water, and everybody says, yuck, my water tastes yucky because it's full of chlorine. Instead, they can treat it specifically for whatever specific
Well, the chlorine is put in for a different purpose. Chlorine is put in to take care of biologicals.
Right.
We don't really deal with the biologicals.
Yes.
There's other people who do that. But the metals, which is a different one, and the other problem with metals is you don't know what industry's upstream from you.
Right.
And industry is notoriously bad about saying, oh, we've got a whole bunch of stuff. Nobody's watching at 2 in the morning, so we'll dump it in the river. But once again, when it drifts down and it gets to the water treatment plant, now, in a lot of cases, if they know that they get something like that, the operator just hits the stop button.
Exactly, yeah.
And they quit pumping for a little while, and they test and see when it's gone by, and then start pumping again.
Yeah, because I'm thinking of, you know, a lot of our big cities, they're going to be down at the mouth of a river. You look at something like Washington, D.C. There's so many small tributaries.
Everybody's upstream from it. Everybody
is upstream of you. Any of those small tributaries could have a storm one day, or a spill one day, or some industrial plant that, we put in the river.
Yeah.
Right.
Or, I mean, you get these big ones where you've got a mine tailings pond failure.
Exactly.
And it dumps 60 million barrels of oil, contaminated water, and with lots of metals in it and all kinds of other stuff. Those sort of incidents, typically you know about them.
Yes.
And if you're at the mouth of the river, you know about them early enough that you can say, okay, we know that's going to hit on Thursday and it's going to last 2 weeks. So produce a reserve to good for 2 weeks worth of people's consumption, and we just shut down.
Got it.
But when you get nearer to it, if you're a small community that's 2 miles downstream from it, it hits your water treatment plant before you know that anything's happened.
Yeah. I mean, what are some of the potential impacts if a utility doesn't catch the metals, particularly for older, younger?
Well, you look at the impact in Flint, Michigan.
Yeah.
And it wasn't metals there; it was actually a change in the pH. But the result was that it caused the lead in the pipes to leach out. Well, the lead resulted in, 3,000 children with permanent lifetime disabilities in Flint, Michigan.
Right.
I mean, it's just a horrendous impact. And it's all preventable.
Yeah. Well, you know, and it's tough to be able to communicate, for a plant to be able to communicate that they need something to treat for metal without scaring people about the potential impacts if there are metals, which there will be.
You've got the spin merchants out there saying, okay, you're going to poison a whole bunch of people, but let's spin it a little bit so it doesn't look so bad. So, and that doesn't help the credibility of industry, and it doesn't help the credibility of their local water treatment plant either.
Right.
Because really, it's the water treatment plant's responsibility to know about this stuff and deal with it. And if they're not testing for it, if you're not testing it and measuring it, you can't control it.
Yes. And so much of the responsibility is placed on the water treatment plant and not the upstream contaminant sources. And then, especially if it is a natural source of just, there's chromium in the soil, and if it rains, we're going to get some. And that's just what happens when you live downstream of soil.
I got a kick out of it because one of the mining companies that we deal with wants to put one upstream of their mine. And I said, why do you want to put it upstream of your mine?
Yeah.
He said, every summer or every spring, we get fined for too much lead in the water. But we don't produce lead.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So he says, we're paying a fine for dropping lead in the water, but we don't have lead in our sources. It's coming upstream. If I can prove that it's coming from upstream, I don't pay the fine anymore.
Yes. Well, that's so much of dealing with contaminants focuses on whose fault is it.
That's right.
Rather than let's just solve the problem.
Well, in this
And,
case,
yeah.
knowing where their mine is, it's up in the mountains someplace,
Yeah.
and it's a natural occurring lead.
Yeah.
So
Well,
It's-
we got lead from somewhere. So
lead is
yeah.
coming in from somewhere, and there are so many of these metals that have natural sources. And you know, even if you don't have a natural source, say for lead today, there can be a rock fall up in the mountains, and all of a sudden, now there's lead.
Right.
And a lot of this stuff, if you're not testing for it on a regular basis, you don't see it until, well, if you're testing once a quarter,
Right.
you've got 3 months where you may have been poisoning people.
Yeah. So good
And not
to
knowing
just sort of putting it in there, make sure you find it and can address it right away.
That's right. And, you know, and quite often it's not hard to address if you know it's there.
Yes. And the cost of testing is so high anyway
Yeah.
that you might as well test for it and treat it versus
Yep.
requiring testing all the time, because it's not going to be there all the time.
And so we're offering that solution. We go in, we put the unit into the line, we test the water as it's coming into the plant. That then feeds back into the control system, so you don't have to have a person making a decision. The computers can say, lead has just become very high, shut down.
Yep.
We need to change a process to deal with this sudden influx of lead, or we have to wait until it flows past us in the river.
Right. And that's very hard to explain if there is a shutdown. I mean, I guess they wouldn't be doing a boil water order, for the town, but if your water's turned off in the town, that
California last year had 7,000 metal advisories. And these would be a small community where their source water has changed, and they now have a metal in it that they weren't treating for.
Yeah.
7,000 communities in California. It's just a phenomenal amount.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of the total number of population, it's not very big, because most of these are 200 to 1,000 people in the community.
Yeah.
It's not like it hits Los Angeles, where it's going to impact millions of people, because Los Angeles has a much more rigorous testing and control procedure. And one of the water treatment plants was talking to us, and he said, the challenge is that the communities that can afford to treat their water properly typically have the best source water.
Right.
The communities that can't afford to treat their water typically have the worst source water.
Do you know if there's any particular funding for this sort of treatment, or any opportunities to...
I know there is funding here, but I don't know how much. Canada is putting about $5 billion a year into funding these water treatment plants.
Yeah.
They figure that it's going to be 30 years before they catch up to the backlog in stuff that they need to do.
So particularly
$5 billion
those
a year.
in, say, mining regions where there is a lot of...
Or indigenous populations, or fishing communities, or farming communities that really aren't very large, but they need fresh water, and they need clean water.
Yep. Very cool. Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you.
For taking the time and explaining what's happening with your real-time metal detection and quantification systems for 2S Water out of Edmonton, Canada. And it's been Anthony Nelson, and this is Water Citizen News.